Hi, everybody. This is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and I'm sitting down to do another episode of Planets in Profile. I'm catching up. I have to do Mars in Cancer, and I've also still got to do Venus in Taurus, which I missed, and Venus now in Gemini. So a couple of videos to catch up on, but hopefully we'll get those done pretty soon in the next couple of days. I'm going to go ahead and put this up on screen. And this particular episode of Planets in Profile, I'm talking about Mars and Cancer, which you may be tired of hearing about already because it's definitely in the spotlight. Astrologically speaking, a lot of astrologers are talking about Mars and Cancer right now. But the purpose of this episode is not so much to talk about the transit or the forecasting of the moment as much as it is to discuss how to read or interpret Mars and Cancer in a general way. So I call this placement, it kind of has at its best, it's kind of a mama bear energy. But at its worst, it can be very moody and temperamental and pretty volatile. So let's talk about some of the basics. Mars in the sign of Cancer is in the home of what the Greeks called Selene, or the moon. And Cancer is a cool, moist, feminine, tropical water sign. So what are each of those? Let's take a look at each of those. So cool, moist. That's kind of the qualities associated with the moon. And then you have this idea of it being a feminine sign. So it's sort of yin in nature. It's tropical, meaning it's a sign at which a turning point happens in the solar year. And it is also a water sign. The element of water is associated with Cancer. So it's the first sign of summer, and it has an association with life. In fact, in the Thema Mundi, which was the chart of the birth of the cosmos, it was a kind of a mythic chart of the birth of the cosmos that ancient astrologers used also as a kind of technical teaching device. Cancer is on the ascendant. The first sign, the rising sign, is Cancer. And so Cancer is associated with birth and also with a proliferation of life. It's the exaltation ruler of Cancer is Jupiter. Jupiter is exalted in the sign of Cancer. But Mars, actually, who is exalted in the sign of Capricorn, takes its fall, or is in its depression in the sign of Cancer. What does that mean? Well, first of all, let's just think about the sign of Cancer a little bit. Here you have a sign that comes at the summer solstice, right as the darkness is really starting to return day by day from the summer solstice forward. The light is waning. It's dropping. The sun is going to go down from that point forward. So the sign, even though it's associated with life and birth and summer on some level, is also associated with decline or descent. And so this is the portal through which ancient astrologers like Manilius, for example, and others talk about. This is the gateway through which the soul begins to incarnate in matter, in a body, in the material world. So through that gateway of the summer solstice, we have not just life in a material sense, but life in terms of the soul beginning its descent from the spiritual realm, let's say, or from a more subtle plane into a more gross plane or into the body. So the Cancer is also associated with that generally. Now, actually, the process of the beginning of death and the release of the soul from the body happens during the winter, which is why Mars is associated with it's Mars's exaltation is in the sign of Saturn, Capricorn, which is the winter solstice, because Mars, like Saturn, is a malefic and is associated with destruction, death, disintegration, division, separation, etc. So where Mars is exalted, there Jupiter is in its fall, and where Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, there Mars is in its fall. Why is this? And actually, Rhetorius explains this to us in his compendium on astrology. He says that this is because Jupiter represents life breath, and at the gateway of the summer solstice, the sign of Cancer, life breath is increased because the spirit is entering a body. It's coming into its mortal vehicle. It's being born. It's gestating and coming into being in the material world. So their life is prolific, and Jupiter is naturally exalted there. Mars, however, which is really more empowered in terms of the destructive energy or the disintegrating energy, which is natural, it's not necessarily evil or anything, but is more associated with the beginning of Capricorn in winter. So Mars is naturally depressed in the sign where the life breath abounds, where life is proliferating. So what that means is that we have an odd pairing. We have Mars as a house guest in the sign of the moon, which is the mother, the biomatrix of Earth, the descent of spirit into matter, the multiplication and replication of material forms, the fluctuation and flow of life in the material world, from weather to the fluids in our bodies to the ocean and the tides. The moon is sort of the natural significator of all that moves and turns and churns and flows in the material world, the ecological movements that we're all entangled with. So that's the moon's territory. Mars is about division and cutting and separation and death to a certain extent, and also is a planet that is really about separation, and you could even think of it as, again, cutting. So in some ways this is natural as well. Like, you have to cut the umbilical cord when we come out of our mother's womb. The umbilical cord must be cut. And so sometimes Mars in Cancer in general will represent the difficulty but necessity of severing or cutting bonds, of cutting cords, as we sometimes say in sort of shamanic talk, or of making hard divisions where we have to say, try to slice through something and divide. Now, sometimes we have to do that in order to protect, in order to defend. This is why I call it a mother bear energy. Sometimes in order to defend, we have to ward off danger. Sometimes in order to defend that which is vulnerable or weaker, we have to become an advocate, or maybe we become a protector or guardian. These are Mars and Cancer themes as well. But Mars and Cancer, of course, can also be about the disruption or violation of things that are bonded or melded together or joined or yoked. For example, as Mars went into Cancer, we saw the death of a pregnant woman who went just to go and get some clothing from a Facebook marketplace ad. And because they wanted her child. It was just, pure jealousy. So the jealous mother, death of the mother, a lot of Mars and Cancer themes were apparent in that story. The challenge to the abortion laws, those are the whole topic, the back and forth, the debate itself around all of those themes: protection of an innocent child, protection of the rights of a mother and sovereignty over her body. These are all Mars and Cancer themes. Also, we see things like protection of the environment. So there's a lot of different things that can come up, but you either have the idea, and here's another way of thinking about it, which I've said in every single video I've made on these planets in profile. You always want to think of Mars. If Mars is not in Aries or Scorpio, its home signs, then it's a house guest in somebody else's sign. So how does that house guest provide? For example, Mars is sitting down for dinner and Mars is like, I want war, I want strife, I want to cut, or I want to defend, or I want to display courage or assert myself. And the moon says, okay, well, I have to provide you with material to take, you want to take those actions, I got to give you the raw material to do it with. So the moon serves up women, the moon serves up pregnancy, the moon serves up the umbilical cord, the moon serves up nature. See, like that. You can always think about what the planet is likely to get in terms of what its host is willing to provide based on the host's natural significations. And that's why we have this whole language in ancient astrology, because it teaches us how to understand different combinations of symbolism. Archetypes don't exist in a vacuum. Archetypes are always in dialogue with one another. So some are more difficult than others. This is not an easy place for Mars. Mars is said to be depressed in this sign also because it doesn't get along necessarily with its host in terms of their agendas and what they like or what they want to do. So at its worst, that can create things like passive aggression, or it can create things like, violence towards women, or it can create really tempestuous moodiness, the emotional quality of Cancer, this kind of moody, volatile, aggressive. It can also create, sometimes there's also themes of darkness. Mars is darkness and death, and the combination of darkness and death with things that are supposedly sweet or supposedly maternal or supposedly safe or protected, and it can expose the darkness around them. So let's talk about some celebrities with Mars in Cancer. Chris Brown, who's a famous musician who was also famously known for domestic assault. It's pretty serious. I forget what his girlfriend's name. I think it was Rihanna. This seems like a long time ago now. Robin Williams. Robin Williams, of course, committed suicide. And so we had severe depression and anxiety at different times in his life. So you have also the moon as it represents the psychology, the mind, and the body. Sometimes you'll see Mars in the sign of the moon creating agitation of the mind, agitation of the body. And that's one of the potentially classic placements for really harsh or difficult things that happen to one's mind or body. Robin Williams, of course, was also an advocate for the weak, the vulnerable, the sick. He was famously said to have visited Christopher Reeve in the hospital. I think it's Reeve. Superman, when he was paralyzed, and he went and visited him and got him to smile, like pretending I believe that he was a doctor who needed to check his prostate or something like that. And he also worked with I forget the name of the gorilla and children, and he plays Patch Adams, and he's often an advocate for, like in Dead Poet Society, he's the advocate for the poetic, sensitive nature of the young men. So this kind of poetic sensitivity, but also this kind of charismatic emotional quality, Mars in Cancer. Stephen King, who was struck by a van and thrown into a deep ditch, literally a deep depression, a ravine off the side of the road. Also a famous horror author, novelist. Stephen King writes about attack or assault on things that are vulnerable. Think about it. Cujo. There's a dog, a nice family dog that's goes crazy, right? Carrie, a young girl that goes crazy. Misery, a nice woman in the woods, so to speak, who goes crazy. The Shining, a woman, another kind of woman who goes crazy, and also a man that goes crazy and chases after his son, his vulnerable son, if I remember correctly. I think it was a son. So many of Stephen King's stories are a clown chasing after kids. So the vulnerable and the attack on the vulnerable, that's so scary, such a part of his repertoire. David Lynch, think about Twin Peaks. It's the cozy little town that's really dark. He always takes things that look kind of nice and classic and polished and exposes this kind of crazy dark underbelly. It's Mars in Cancer. Al Capone, trafficker in alcohol, moonshine, the alcohol, of course, and drinking traditionally associated with the moon as well, and Mars, the violence and the kind of mob scene. Alanis Morissette, you have a sort of a kind of a feminist rocker. Same thing with Jewel, and you have Michael Phelps, This was at a time Alanis Morissette, my memory of Alanis Morissette and Jewel is that they were, alternative rockers in the 90s, sort of popular alternative rockers in the 90s who sort of put like feminist alternative music on the map in popular culture. Not that it wasn't there before, but Michael Phelps, who's of course an Olympic swimmer, got very literal Mars and a water sign, athlete in water. Malcolm X, who defended and advocated for the African American rights, but also had this kind of had the real like tribal feeling to it, and there was the brotherhood and this idea of there was a more like, what do I want to say? With Malcolm X, you get the feeling, Mars and Cancer, also of the stance that he had that was more aggressive toward civil rights and towards the rights of his people and sort of his tribe. There's a more tribal feeling, whereas you get to people like Martin Luther King Jr. and you have Venus and Pisces. It's very like collective. It's Malcolm X has more of a feeling of being like a tribal fighter, right? So Karl Marx also, on behalf of the worker, and so the advocacy on behalf of the everyday or the common. The moon is also the people or the commoner. Robert Smith, who is lead singer of Cure, sort of heavy, moody, emotional, deep, depressive, dark, but also beautiful. Jewel, I already mentioned. Dolly Parton, famously, of course, cancer rules the breasts. And Dolly Parton said, I think it was on the Oprah show, I found this quote, and she said, she's had like basically countless plastic surgeries to keep up with her public image and to maintain this appearance, especially her sort of iconic breasts. And I don't mean to objectify her by saying that, like, this is what she herself said. So I just, I couldn't help it. I was like, she's gone under the knife many times in order to, keep that image intact, including her breasts. So that's a Mars and Cancer thing, which rules the breasts. Anyway, these are interesting associations for sure, and lots more could be said about Mars and Cancer. But in your own birth chart, here's a few tips for interpreting Mars and Cancer. One would be, if Mars and Cancer is in your chart, you want to be careful around the volatility of moods. That's one thing to be careful of. However, don't be surprised if you have some need to protect or defend the weak or vulnerable. On the other hand, the feminine warrior kind of principle together in the sign of the moon. Another thing to look at is, where is the moon in the chart and what relationship aspectually does Mars have to the moon? If you got a trine or sextile, it's probably easier than an opposition, so you want to look at the position of the moon and its house and its aspectual relationship to Mars to see what kind of reception Mars has with its host. The better the reception or connection, the easier that Mars signature generally works out. So that's a brief summary of how to look at your chart. Look at the house that it's in, look at the topics of that house, and then think, okay, Mars in Cancer is going to dish up this kind of martial lunar combination within the topics of this area of my life, whether that's relationships or money or jobs or, whatever. A good way to treat Mars in Cancer is to find activity, action, Mars, and fluidity or emotional dynamism. And if you can get those things together, Mars will be happy. So you're going to keep your Mars happy. It's a good tip. Okay, thanks everyone for listening. And I'll be back hopefully soon with some updates on planets and profile for Venus and Taurus and Venus and Gemini. Okay, take care. Bye.